We speak of the Pacific theater in the Second World War with a certain mythic grandeur, the unyielding heroism of Guadalcanal, the desperate bravery of Iwo Jima. We focus on the decisive battles, the strategic victories, the ultimate unconditional surrender. But there is a vast, silent chapter in this history, a chapter fought not against the Allied forces, but against starvation itself. It's the story of the moral collapse that occurred when the laws of nature superseded the laws of man, when the last vestiges of military discipline were consumed by the gnawing, maddening pain of utter famine. This is the chronicle of the Cannibal Islands. For hundreds of thousands of Imperial Japanese soldiers, the war's end was not a bullet, but a slow, agonizing dissipation of the self. Their theater of war was a prison of their own making, a consequence of logistical arrogance and a fanatical doctrine that left them marooned and utterly forgotten. The year is late 1944. The island is New Guinea. Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi, commander of the Japanese 18th Army, has received his final, impossible order: retreat. Cut off by Allied naval and air superiority, facing annihilation, his remaining forces, nearly 100,000 men, were ordered to march hundreds of miles along the coast to the Sepik River. This was not a tactical withdrawal. It was a death march. Adachi's forces were already ghosts. Their resupply lines had been shattered months earlier. Food rations had ceased. The body count from combat was dwarfed by the number lost to disease and starvation. The Japanese military doctrine, predicated on self-sufficiency, feeding the army from the occupied land, had proven to be a fatal fantasy in the hostile, unyielding environment of the tropics. Imagine a soldier, once the embodiment of martial rigor, now reduced to a shuffling shadow. His rifle, once a trusted extension of his purpose, is now an unbearable burden. He has consumed nothing but grass, tree bark, and the boiled leather of his boots for weeks. Every step is a negotiation with his rapidly failing heart. His comrades, his brothers in arms, are also his competitors for the last remaining scraps of life. The first stage of collapse was the loss of control over the stomach. Then came the madness of the mind. Soldiers began to experience delusions, driven by acute starvation and vitamin deficiency. Their focus narrowed to a single, terrifying truth: the total annihilation of self, if the body was not fed. This was where the laws of war, a code built over centuries, meant to govern conflict with honor, died first. The march to the Sepik River was a descent into primal chaos. Of the nearly 100,000 Japanese soldiers who participated in that horrific journey, over 90% would die of starvation and disease. The military machine had been systematically cannibalizing its own men through institutional neglect and a fanaticism that forbade tactical retreat or surrender. This catastrophe was not merely the misfortune of a defeated army. It was a failure rooted in the highest echelons of the imperial command structure. Post-Midway, the Japanese Empire adopted Gyokusai, the doctrine of shattering like a jewel, a euphemism for suicidal last stands. This fanaticism was combined with the crippling belief in self-sufficiency. The navy, responsible for supply, was decimated. The army, believing it could live off the land, was stranded. The logistical disconnect was a death sentence delivered by the empire itself. On islands across the Pacific, New Guinea, Bougainville, the Philippines, thousands of men were simply left to wither. The official death toll due to Allied action paled in comparison to the number claimed by disease and starvation. The soldier must feed himself from the land, or be consumed by it. As supplies dwindled, the men's diet became a slow, desperate inventory of the jungle. Rats, snakes, centipedes, and insects were staples. But even this meager sustenance eventually ran out. The Japanese term for this period, shokuyu nashi, literally no food, became a devastating understatement. The men's bodies, pushed past the point of endurance, began the final, irreversible shutdown. The psychological warfare of the body against the mind began to break the most rigid military conditioning. The concept of Bushido, the warrior code that emphasized honor, loyalty, and self-sacrifice, became a cruel joke when the primal instinct for survival took over. The descent into cannibalism, the consumption of human flesh, was not an act of cultural ritual or premeditated malice for the vast majority. It was the absolute, crushing psychological and moral collapse of men pushed beyond the boundaries of human endurance. Testimonies collected after the war reveal a horrifying, clinical progression. It began with the deceased. An unspoken, terrifying utilitarian logic took root. When a comrade succumbed to disease or exhaustion, his remains represented the last, desperate chance for others to live. Officers, driven by the need to maintain some semblance of a fighting force, often turned a blind eye or even tacitly sanctioned the practice. The shame was profound. Survivors later spoke of the act with deep, corrosive guilt. They knew they had crossed an absolute boundary. The internal conflict was a war worse than the jungle fighting, my survival versus my soul. The most documented and terrifying cases, however, involved the murder of Allied POWs, specifically for consumption. In pockets of New Guinea and the Philippines, Japanese units, cut off and starving, saw the occasional captured Australian or American airman not as a prisoner, but as a resource. These acts, driven by a desperate, maniacal logic, were the ultimate violation of the laws of war and cemented the Allied perception of their enemy as subhuman monsters. This distinction is vital. The self-consumption born of starvation was a tragic failure of command. The consumption of Allied POWs was a premeditated war crime. Both were symptoms of the same disease, a total, absolute breakdown of civilization under the stress of war and fanatical logistics. The general told us, "You will survive by any means. There is no shame in life, only in failure," a terrifying distortion of duty. The question that haunts these silent jungles, the question that demands our attention, is how this profound horror affected the advancing Allied forces. What was the antithesis, the terrifying, vengeful reaction that the discovery of these atrocities provoked? The horror on one side of the jungle was about to fuel a new, terrible brutality on the other. The war in the Pacific was fundamentally a conflict of unremitting hatred. The atrocities committed by the Imperial Japanese Army, the systemic mistreatment of POWs, the Bataan Death March, the denial of surrender had already poisoned the moral atmosphere. The advancing Allied forces operated in a state of high emotional volatility and profound distrust. The desperation that drove Japanese soldiers to cannibalism was an internal tragedy. But the discovery of their acts, particularly the consumption of Allied prisoners, was the catalytic event that irrevocably altered the moral landscape for the Americans and Australians. It provided a psychological justification for what was already a brutal, merciless war, a campaign of no quarter. The year is early 1945. The location, Borneo, or the deeper reaches of the Philippines. Allied troops, moving through isolated Japanese defensive pockets, began finding documentation that defied comprehension. The Japanese military, driven by a rigid cultural necessity for meticulous record-keeping, had unintentionally left behind the darkest evidence of their collapse, diaries and personal journals. These were not vague entries. They were detailed, stark, and terrifying chronicles of survival. They described the progression from hunting rats to consuming the deceased, and, in several documented instances, the premeditated killing of Allied prisoners specifically to sustain the remaining troops. Corporal K was selected today. It was difficult, but the company commander decreed it necessary. His flesh was surprisingly good, and the remaining men gained a measure of strength. We will survive. This was the shattering truth. The enemy was no longer simply a brave, fanatical fighter. The discovery fueled the pre-existing narrative, transforming the Japanese soldier into a subhuman predator. The news of these diaries, filtering back up the command chain and quietly down the front line, provided a moral release valve for the rage and trauma of the Allied soldiers. The laws of war, and the obligation to treat prisoners humanely, were immediately and tacitly suspended by the visceral horror of the discovery. The official military codes, the Geneva Conventions, mandated that any combatant attempting to surrender must be taken alive and treated humanely. But on the Pacific Islands, this code had eroded to a dangerous suggestion. The Japanese, through their Gyokusai doctrine, made surrender rare. But when it did occur, the Allied response was often brutally swift. The discovery of cannibalism against Allied personnel provided the final, terrible piece of psychological justification for the take-no-prisoners policy that many units had already adopted. The Japanese soldier was now seen not as a combatant, but as a moral pathogen. To spare him was to invite possible deception, banzai charges, or a future act of unimaginable savagery. The war descended into a cycle of reciprocal savagery. The desperation of the Japanese bred horrors that, in turn, stripped the last vestige of discipline from many Allied troops. The war was no longer fought by rules, it was fought by the primal urge of vengeance. The prophetic figure in this moral descent was the common Allied soldier, the frontline veteran who had witnessed the Bataan Death March, or the brutal executions of captured airmen, or now, the evidence of cannibalism. These men knew that the moral compromise demanded by this specific conflict would haunt them forever. They were forced to make impossible choices in the crucible of absolute hatred. When you saw what they did to your buddy, you didn't see a man anymore. You saw a beast. And you didn't take a chance. You had your line, and we crossed it. We all crossed it, recounted a Marine veteran of the Peleliu campaign. This wasn't just physical fighting. It was a psychological and moral degradation that cut both ways. The Allied forces, in reacting to the horrors they discovered, risked becoming a reflection of the brutality they despised. When the war finally ended, the war crimes tribunals had to grapple with the unspeakable. Cases of cannibalism, particularly against Allied POWs, were taken up with seriousness. Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi, the commander of the starving 18th Army in New Guinea, surrendered and faced trial in Rabaul. He was charged not with committing cannibalism himself, but with general command responsibility for the massive atrocities of his starving troops. This included the documented cases of consuming the enemy. The trials were complex. Adachi refused to shift the blame to his soldiers or his superiors. He took full responsibility for the failure of his campaign, which led to the famine and the resulting moral collapse. Before his conviction and life sentence, he penned a final, self-sacrificial statement. "I deeply regret that I cannot repay my obligations to those under my command. In this way, I wish to atone for my crimes." This statement is crucial. Adachi was atoning not just for the atrocities, but for the institutional failure, the logistical suicide that forced his men into such a desperate state. He carried the entire burden of a failed, fanatic war. The tribunals achieved one critical outcome. They forced a legal and historical recognition of the horror. They created a framework for the truth. However, they did not and could not address the deeper, psychological wounds inflicted on the Allied soldiers who had witnessed the starvation and the cannibalism, and who had executed the no-quarter response. The true development of this story lies in the profound silence that followed the war. How did the survivors, Japanese and Allied, carry this unique, unspeakable horror into their peacetime lives? How does a man who has witnessed and participated in the absolute shattering of humanity ever find peace? The war ended, the formal documents were signed, but for those who survived the moral and physical abyss of the Cannibal Islands, the war did not simply conclude. It retreated, festering in the dark corners of the mind. There was no immediate return to normalcy. There was only a profound, collective silence. The unique shame of this conflict, the ultimate act of desperation by the defeated, and the ultimate act of vengeance by the victors was too heavy, too grotesque to be processed by a world desperate to embrace peace and forget the trauma. Post-war Japan, under the new constitution, sought to surgically remove the taint of the imperial past. The soldiers who returned from the islands were not celebrated heroes. They were often unwanted relics of a failed, fanatical ideology. The survivors of New Guinea and Bougainville carried a double burden, the shame of defeat and the unspeakable, moral taint of cannibalism. Their response was a survival mechanism, absolute, unbreakable secrecy. They instinctively understood that the extreme duress they endured was not an excuse the world would accept. For decades, the stories remained buried. The accounts that did emerge were cloaked in euphemism, extreme hardship, lack of sustenance. To tell the full truth was to risk ostracization and to burden their children with an unforgivable past. We swore never to speak of the jungle, not to our wives, not to our children. To tell them was to force them to share a shame that was ours alone. It was the only way to shield them. The only way to live. From recorded testimony taken in the 1,980 seconds. This silence became the deepest wound. It prevented healing, creating a generation of men who walked among the living, but whose souls were still trapped in the rot and famine of the jungle. The Allied soldiers, too, suffered from a profound and unique psychological toll. They were the victors, but they had paid a price in their humanity. The exposure to the extreme brutality of the enemy, culminating in the discovery of cannibalism, forced many to cross their own moral red line. The no-quarter policy, the sight of starving, desperate men, and the need to execute soldiers attempting to surrender left a lasting, corrosive guilt. This guilt was not addressed in the post-war celebrations. There was no category for the trauma of having to dehumanize an enemy to the point of extinction. They had done what was necessary to survive, but the moral injury remained. The true historical development of this trauma only became apparent years later, with the formal recognition of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. The men of the Pacific, who had seen the boundaries of civilization crumble, both among their enemy and within their own response, were archetypes of this silent suffering. Their exposure was not just to combat, but to absolute moral horror. The final act of courage for the survivors, both Japanese and Allied, was not a military charge, but the breaking of the silence. Decades after the war, a trickle of honest testimony began to emerge. Historians and researchers, motivated by the fragments of truth from the war crimes trials, began to listen. This open truth allowed for the slow process of reconciliation. It allowed the world to finally see the Japanese soldier, not just as a fanatic, but as a victim of his own command's fanatical, flawed logistics. It also allowed the Allied veteran to articulate the moral injury, the terrible choices they had to make when facing an enemy that had already lost its own humanity. The enduring legacy of the Cannibal Islands is a single, terrifying lesson for all generations. The ultimate weapon against the cruelty of war is not a bomb or a bullet, but the unbreakable commitment to humanity. The moment a command structure prioritizes ideology and fanaticism over the basic welfare of its men, it begins the process of consuming its own soul. The men who survived the siege of the inner man, the Japanese soldiers who endured the hunger, and the Allied soldiers who endured the horror, define a unique, terrifying form of courage. The will to resist the total surrender of the self to the primal darkness.